Hello, good evening and welcome to Vantage Point. I'm Nadim Majid. As always, we're joined by Dr. Dayan Jayathilaka. Dr. Dayan Jayathilaka, we'd like to drive straight into the material, lots of stuff to cover. I was actually looking at a recent article that you posted on a website about the 19th...
Do I get to say good evening, at least? Go ahead.
The 19th Amendment.
Okay.
You can say good evening and start your answer if you want, but the 19th Amendment. A constitutional cyanide capsule. Fear-mongering much? Cyanide capsule?
Well, that was a bit naughty, but I was appalled by this. In the first place, Nadim, it's not a constitutional amendment. Why does anybody call it a constitutional amendment? I mean, have you seen the size of it?
60 pages.
Yeah. I mean, when you have an amendment that's pretty much the size of your constitution, then it's not an amendment. And when you read that, you would see that there are several chunks of the Constitution, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, and so on and so forth, which are repealed. They say that repeatedly. And this is repealed, this is repealed, this is repealed. When you come to the sort of the third repeal, then you know this is not an amendment. I mean, we've had the 18th Amendment, bad as it was. You had the 13th Amendment, contentious as it was, but it was an amendment on a specific issue. That's an amendment. When you repeal the whole chunks of the Constitution and you have a thick document in its place, that's an abrogation. It's not an amendment. Now, you're familiar with the line, the Western media cliche, why is this so-and-so lying to me? At the point of an interview where you think, and I'm being polite, why is this so-and-so lying to me? So when somebody tells me that this is an amendment, and it is manifestly not, it involved multiple repeals, and it's a very thick text, it upends the whole logic of the existing constitution, I ask myself, why are they calling it an amendment?
Well, doesn't it sort of also detail their purposes as stated in their election campaign? Isn't this a representation, isn't this 60-page text a representation of all of that they wanted to change?
Well, isn't there a division of opinion within the coalition precisely on this matter of interpretation? You have the Honourable Prime Minister and the main drafter of the amendment,
Dr. Vikramaratne.
That's right, saying, here's the thing, this is what we got the mandate for, and this is what we have done. You walked in here for advanced surgery, and that's what we are doing. And then you have other ministers, such as Mr. Patali Champikaranavaka and his party, which says no. The candidate always said that the excessive, the authoritarian powers of the president would be shed. Now, this is a battle of interpretations which is very serious. It's at the heart of the matter. Are we talking about the shedding of the surplus powers of the executive presidency, or, as Prime Minister Wickremesinghe and Dr. Vikramaratne say,
the abolition of the presidency,
by the pretty much wholesale transfer of power, which shifts the center of gravity of the Constitution from the elected presidency
but
to
even as per the 19th Amendment, it's not a total abolition, is it? I mean, according to the draft, because the president is still the commander-in-chief. He's still sort of the Minister of Defense. He controls the armed forces.
Well, that's what makes it even more of a travesty. Because, if there were a transparent process, you could have a multi-party discussion on what constitutes excess, what's surplus. Then you have a consensus on what you drop. Now, you don't even have that within the government, which is why you have these two views. And there's something of a deadlock, masquerading as a dispute over the electoral system. That's a classic sort of scapegoat or displacement. But it's really about this. The logic of any presidential system, well, the logic of any democratic constitution is that the institution or the office in which popular sovereignty is preeminently vested is the centerpiece of the constitution. Anywhere in the world where you have an elected presidency, nationally elected, even though there could be an intermediate step such as the Electoral College in the United States, but you're really talking about a direct national election, then by virtue of the fact that the presidency is elected by a majority of the people, that is the most important institution in the Constitution. That's the center of gravity. Now, according to the 19th Amendment, the presidency shall remain nationally elected even beyond the term of office of President Sirisena. That does not change. Therefore, there is no grounds on which that presidency can be made subservient to, subordinate to the Prime Minister and or the Constitutional Council. Actually, it happens in both instances, because neither one of those two institutions are drawn from the popular base of the popular vote, as is the office of the President.
But there is a flaw to that, because the Prime Minister will be selected by the President.
Yeah,
the MP who he feels commands the confidence of Parliament.
Well, it's like this. Let's say that in the discussion over this program, I get to make one choice, and that is who's going to be the anchor. And that's you. But after that, that's my one shot. I have to act always on your advice. Then very clearly the center of gravity shifts to you. Now, the 19th Amendment says that the President shall, except in the matter of the choice of the Prime Minister, always act on the advice of the Prime Minister or on the advice of a minister designated by the Prime Minister in the matter with which that minister is concerned. So in other words, President Sirisena would have to act not only always on the advice of Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, but always on the advice of Minister Akila Viraj Karyavasam.
Depending on if it is Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, you don't know whether it is going to be Prime Minister Wickremesinghe.
Yes, whoever. But the Prime Ministership is not drawn from the broad base of the franchise, as is the presidency. So, by what conceivable logic would an elected president, I underscore that, a nationally elected president, not a ceremonial president, be turned pretty much ceremonial? Having to act always, yes, having to act always, is mandatory on the advice of the Prime Minister. And there's another fetter, and that this is not checks and balances. It's a fetter in the form of the Constitutional Council, made of 10 persons, of whom 7 are unelected
nominees.
Yeah. So, I mean, where does popular sovereignty come into this? The President has to act in a number of matters, with certain exceptions, on the advice of, or as allowed by, the Constitutional Council, of which 7 out of 10 are nominated individuals. Now, who knows what considerations will go in to the process of nomination. The President gets to appoint 1. So this is a complete upending of the system, and an upending of the system, Nadeem, requires a lot more transparency, a lot more time.
A lot more consultation.
Deliberation. That is why constitutions are not made like instant noodles, and that's why I find this 19th Amendment definitionally dishonest, because it's not an amendment; it's a new draft constitution, and processually flawed, because you need a far more transparent and protracted process, so that there will be a national consensus, at least a parliamentary consensus, on what is the fundamental law of the country. And then, of course, I have a problem with content, the upending, where it is not the institution that represents popular sovereignty in the broadest sense, but a far narrower institution that holds the whip hand.
Yeah. Dr. Jayatilaka, I also have a problem here with the 19th Amendment, the proposed electoral reforms, and all this talk of elections, having elections around the corner, and national governments. I feel that it's sort of distracting from the work at hand that Parliament has. Pledges for right to information, re-establishing the independent commissions. Basically, the pillars of ensuring that you have good governance.
Yes.
So it's become so good governance seems to have gone out the window, while this tug of war between the UNP, the SLFP, and the JVP, etc., a multiple tug of war is going on. How do you see this?
I see it as completely unnecessary. And then I ask myself, why are parties playing these games? Because that's another way of doing this. You could just limit yourself to what everybody agrees upon. And there are things that everybody agrees on. The independent commissions, probably the term of office, 2 5-year terms. People agree on that. They agree on the right to information. So why not do the doable, which is basically restore a strengthened version of the 17th Amendment, repealing the 18th Amendment. Now that's what this is supposed to be, but what it's not. Because it tries to do too many things in one go. Why try that when there's a battle of interpretations? There is no battle of interpretations, not just between the UNP, JVP on the one hand and JHU on the other, but not even between the UNP and the SLFP.
On things like
the commissions. I mean, there is a section in this draft which makes for that. Why not just pull it out? You can get your 2/3 very easy. It can be done next week. Why not do that?
Might have the all 200 plus members voting for.
Absolutely. You can. There are many things in this draft that can be almost immediately successful in terms of the vote. Uncontentious. Why try this complex, uncontentious operation now? I mean, you want to do it after an election.
Why? What do you see as the logic behind, or the reasoning of the people who want to have this series of amendments?
Look, if somebody tries to smuggle something through a security barrier, then you can be sure he or she is up to no good. So if you're trying to smuggle a cart and horses through something that you call the 19th Amendment, then it should be checked for contraband. I think the UNP knows that if this is debated not only in the House but even in the country, in the Supreme Court, and goes before the people at a national referendum, there's a chance that they might lose. So that is why they are trying to smuggle this in, disguised as an amendment, when it's a new draft constitution.
Now, the president, Maithripala Sirisena, is currently in the United Kingdom. We still haven't heard his thoughts on this 19th Amendment. Do you think he will agree to this castration of his powers?
Well, I think that there's a bit of a proxy war on, isn't there? You have the JHU saying that the mandate was for the reform.
Not the abolition.
Yeah. That was a Freudian slip. Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh says, look, I translated the manifesto and it was for reform, not for abolition. And then you have the UNP saying, no, this was for abolition. Jayapati Vikramaratne, who represents pretty much Chandrika, says the same thing. So there is a proxy war that's on. The Sri Lanka Freedom Party has tacked on a condition, which is, if you need our numbers, you'd better reform the electoral system as well. Now, I don't know whether that's a delaying tactic because they want to dilute, and quite understandably, the reforms or the abolition of the executive powers of the president. Maybe it's a filibuster. And I can understand why they'd want to do that. They wouldn't want an SLFP president to lose most of his power. So that's what's going on. And it's leading to a deadlock which cannot but affect development activity and general economic life.
Dr. Jayatilaka, getting on to electoral reforms now. You said that maybe the SLFP is using the talk of electoral reforms as a filibuster to prevent SLP president. Is it also not a tactic to prevent elections from being called, to prevent Parliament from being prorogued in April and elections being called?
Yes, but it's not going to be all that successful, is it? Because if you do have these reforms on a fast track, and the Commission of Elections seems to have indicated that it would take a little over a month. This is what the scuttlebutt says. Then you cannot postpone the elections indefinitely unless President Sirisena chooses to hold on till next April, which is when he has to have elections. It's really the President's choice. But the electoral reforms as such cannot take you from here to next April. They can be put in place within several weeks, not a few weeks, but several weeks, and you could have an election in the second half of the year.
At an election in the second half of the year. Now, the political lines of power are still a little blurry after the 8th of January, especially for the SLFP. The SLFP is at a sort of a crossroads, trying to figure out what is in the heart and what is on the outside, to quote you. What will happen at an election? Will we see a grand return of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa in the form of a Prime Ministerial candidate, or will it be opposition leader Nemal Siripala de Silva who takes up that mantle?
Well, it would rather depend on the backdrop against which the elections are being held. Now, there are three possibilities. One possibility is the status quo. So you have Wickremesinghe administration, April 23. Maybe if Mr. Wickremesinghe feels flexible, another month for the electoral reforms to be put in place, and then you go in for elections, but you've had essentially a UNP administration before the elections. That's scenario A. Scenario B would be the so-called national government, which means a bipartisan government, UNP SLFP, which was on the cards over the last few weeks. But the United National Party doesn't seem happy about it. And the UNP has begun to say, well, the national government was supposed to be after the election, not before, and certainly not as a substitute for early elections. So, if there is no possibility of a national government, then the next scenario, the scenario C, would be an SLFP government. And Vidura Vikramanayake, an interesting younger politician who's not identified with any camp, said, well, after April 23rd, Mr. Vikramasinghe can, if he so wishes, pack his bags and leave Temple Trees, and then the SLFP will take over, form a government, and we shall resume all the development work that the UNP has halted. I'm certainly hoping that includes the lane down which I live, where there are gouges and there's building equipment and everything is stopped. And I don't know why, it has nothing to do with me, but I hope they get it done before the rainy season. And this is supposed to be in the administrative capital of the country. Anyway, that's scenario C. President Sirisena brings in his old party, the SLFP, gives them a chance at patronage. Part of it is a sort of a counter-insurgency move against the Rajapaksa political insurgency that's brewing. So those are three scenarios. There are sub-scenarios, or there are variants. I'll just run one past you. And that would be that President Sirisena has an option of an SLFP government with a UNP component. I don't know whether there would be UNPers who would be willing to cross over and join an administration under President Sirisena, but which is preeminently SLFP.
Now, in the run-up to the election, one of the campaign promises, and I believe this was in the manifesto as well, was that parliamentary elections would be held, and afterwards you'd have a national government where the leader of the party with the most votes would become the Prime Minister, and then Deputy Prime Minister would be from the leader of the party with the second highest votes, and so on and so forth. Can such, given what we're seeing now, there are already a couple of SLFPers in this government. You have the cabinet spokesperson, Dr. Rajitha Senaratne. You also have the JHU elements and SLMC. So various elements. True, it is essentially a UNP administration, but there are SLFP elements in it. Given the sort of discord that we're seeing now, can we really go from this bipolar system that we've had since post-independence to a national government? Can you really expect these two parties to work cooperatively on anything?
Well, Nadeem, I think we'll move in the opposite direction, because what I see is that you had an unorthodox alliance for the election, which is no bad thing. But since the UNP was not willing to change its leadership and therefore become more electable, it had to enter an alliance with a high-level defector from the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the General Secretary of the party. The gamble worked. So now you have the inevitable contradictions of that particular equation. Now, when you add to that the nature of the constitutional reforms, which shifts power from, a strong overarching center, the presidency, to parliament, the cabinet, and essentially the prime minister, then you are talking about an architectural change which does not anchor bipartisanship. It actually makes for polycentrism, a multipolar situation. At the very least, residual president, empowered prime minister, unspecified deputy prime ministership, provincial councils, and constitutional council, council of state. Now, when you reconfigure the floor, the basis in that manner, then politics takes those shapes. You will have different factions. It will be kaleidoscopic. If we are lucky. If we are unlucky, it will be a pinball machine. So I don't see political stability in the form of a national government as a durable prospect. You could have it, but it'll be like those coalitions in Italy or in Israel or whatever, or Sri Lanka at one time, which keep changing. I mean, there's this joke about the French Fourth Republic, which was essentially a parliamentary system, which is why General de Gaulle instituted the Fifth Republic, which Sri Lanka modeled its 78 constitution on. The joke is this cabbie who took a guy to the parliament, to the National Assembly, where I used to drop in when I was ambassador. And he says, do you want me to stay or do you want me to leave? Are you going to pay me? And then the other guy says, oh, I'll pay you, I'm just going to parliament. And then the cabbie says, then I think I'll stay. Because coalitions were shifting quite so quickly. So I worry about the institutional reconfiguration, which inevitably creates dynamics which make for clustering. Coalitions, lobbies, caucuses around these new centers of gravity. And I don't think you're going to have a national government in the sense of a stable bipartisan coalition.
So what you're recommending that should happen, or what you're advising should happen, is a return to a bipolar situation?
Well, I mean, if you take international politics, you will find that the bipolar situation meant for greater stability. But here I'm saying, just do it by the book. Agree on what you can get the broadest agreement, which is basically the repeal of the 18th Amendment and restoring the 17th Amendment, strengthening it. Do that now. Have your electoral reforms if you want. You have your Dinesh Guruvardhana report, which took 6 years, which means it's well thought through. Have that. Have your election in the second half of the year. And then if you want a new constitution, do it the way it's done everywhere in the world and the way it was done in Sri Lanka. Have a transparent process. Turn the parliament into a constituent assembly. Give it a year and have yourself a new constitution.
And then once the MPs burn it up in the well of parliament.
Well, I think we can prevent that this time.
Still a possibility.
Yeah. You mean before we shoot the Indian fishermen or after?
Actually, I'd like to come to that now, the shooting of the Indian fishermen and the mysterious relationship with Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the foreign policy of the current government. Now, on the last episode of Vantage Point, we were talking about how there seems to be a divergence of the foreign policy of the president, and the foreign policy of the Prime Minister, and by extension the foreign minister. Now, the president, in the UK, meets with the Defence Secretary of the UK and tells him our foreign policy is the non-aligned policy. Now, at the same time that the president is talking about non-aligned policies, we see that our relationship with China is becoming strained, to say the least. There have been statements that have been coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which anyone who's familiar with diplomatic language would see as veiled threats. Do not, basically it's a very stern, do not mess this up. At the same time, you've got the Indian Prime Minister who's, when this episode is airing, who would have come and gone. But a week before he's left, you've got our Prime Minister saying he's going to, that Indian fishermen that they will shoot at Indian fishermen who cross maritime boundaries. What is this fiasco?
Well, while President Sirisena's foreign policy does seem to be non-aligned, the foreign policy of Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's administration seems to be simply unhinged. I mean, it's not aligned to any firm set of considerations of Sri Lanka's national interest. Let's take the television interview. I mean, I'm glad that he said what he did about Chief Minister Vigneswaran's genocide resolution. I mean, 2 cheers for Ranil on that one. I have to say this. I've not been a big fan of Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, but I'm glad he spoke up. So good for him. As for shooting Indian fishermen, this is a new Ranil. Ranil is Rambo, or Ranil is Dirty Harry. That's new. He hasn't actually shot anybody since the last JVP insurgency. He didn't shoot the LTT guys. So maybe it's the Indian fishermen who will have to do. But imagine if Mahinda Rajapaksa had said anything remotely like this, or even Gotabaya, that would have been an outcry in Colombo. My God, look at these barbarians. Look what they're saying. No wonder, send them all back to Madhabulan. But here's Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, who has raised some hackles across the water. Sushma Swaraj, the foreign minister, was quite well disposed to Sri Lanka, actually told the Indian Parliament that the Prime Minister threatened to shoot Indian fishermen, and she said, look, if we are shooting each other, we're going to have a problem, and you have to look at this in a humanitarian way. So, I wonder whether this had any electoral considerations. There are good parts of that interview, by the way, what Prime Minister Wickremesinghe said about human rights.
Again, you also have to consider the, let's say, if you take off the headline, and of course, as a journalist, I understand, the head of government of a country says he's going to shoot some fishermen. That's a major headline. But let's actually get to the content of what he was saying, and it was actually about protecting the rights of northern fishermen. So in that spirit, I suppose you would.
That's sort of mind the Chintana thing, isn't it? Because Mahinda Rajapaksa used to say the same thing. What about the northern fishermen?
Well, their rights deserve to be protected. And what Mr. Wickremesinghe was also saying was that, look, these people have been unable to earn livelihoods for the longest time because of the war, and it was during that time that Indian fishermen started encroaching on Sri Lanka.
Absolutely.
So now these people have to be given their livelihoods back, and they can't do it while they're being harassed at sea by flotillas of
No, he's absolutely right. Which was the same point that the Rajapaksa administration was making. It's just that. The sound bite, if you break into my house, it reminds me of this sticker I saw in the United States, which had a fist with a gun, and it said, "Forget the dog, beware of owner." So, look, seriously, you know what I think is happening? It's a replay of the UNP's foreign policy back in the day, which is the West is with us, we like the Indians, but we really don't care about anybody else, the Indians or the Chinese or the Russians or anyone, because we are with the West and they are with us. That's the UNP's line, except for when Premadasa was president and so on. So, it's not just Ranil. It would be easy to caricature him. But Ranil gives expression to something else. Let's take Foreign Minister Samaravira. He went to Beijing. And at the joint presser, he said something that no foreign minister, not even Secretary of State John Kerry, would have done. He said, we shall be reviewing all the Chinese projects and so on. You don't say that sort of thing. Firstly, because if you know China, and if you don't know China, you should ask Jayanta Dhanapala. If you know China, you know that face is very important. Honor, status. There are certain things you don't do. You don't try to rub their noses in the dust. Especially not if you're a small island with a huge economic problem. The West can't bail you out, much as you think that Washington will bail you out because you're their favorites.
The West is trying to bail itself out.
Washington can't. The Chinese have quite a few US dollars. Even the Americans don't go head to head with the Chinese. Now, we come to the so-called port city project. Look, that was opened by the President of China. So if you want to downsize it, you want to downscale it, you do it with extreme delicacy and discretion. You do not embarrass the Chinese.
I'd like to talk about the Port City project because there were mixed messages, and when I say mixed messages, I mean from all quarters of government there were mixed messages. And then you had the National Executive Committee where the JVP leader Anukumar Dissanayake he gives you one statement: this would be stopped. Before the election, the Prime Minister to be says we'll stop it. After the election, we'll review it and we'll take a look at it, and then if it's okay, we'll go ahead with it.
But Kabir says something else.
Yeah, this hymn sheet is all over the place.
Yeah.
Is this decision to temporarily suspend the Port City project simply caving in to massive external pressure? When I say external pressure, I mean from parties like the JVP, environmentalists, environmental groups.
No, I thought you meant the American and Indians when you said external.
Well, them too. Them too. Is it that? Is it just caving into massive external pressure?
It's simply unwisdom. I mean, look, President Sirisena is about to go to China. Unless somebody wants to pull the rug from under him. You don't send your new president to China, and this is a president who can, and I'm fairly sure will have a good relationship with China. But you don't pull the rug from under him before he goes, unless you really want to do that. President Sirisena has been very clear that he wants to balance between India and China. Now let him do that. The relationship doesn't have to be at the expense of either our friendship with China or our friendship with India. It is possible. Lakshman Kadurgama showed how it could be done. The Rajapaksa administration forgot it during the second term. The new administration has forgotten it yet again in the opposite direction. So the pendulum is swinging too far, and we can't afford it in economic terms. We can't afford it in diplomatic terms either, because, look, Prime Minister David Cameron has done an op-ed in one of the Sri Lankan papers, written around the same time that President Sirisena was visiting London. And Prime Minister Cameron says that he hopes to see the demilitarization of the North and the handing over far more land, civilian lands, by the army back to the original owners.
Which is fair enough.
Nothing is fair enough if he says the same thing to the Israelis. All those Palestinian lands. Plus, if he demilitarizes, I mean removes British soldiers from places that they shouldn't be, outside their own country. We don't have a single soldier except on UN missions outside of Sri Lanka. He also talks about the release of detainees who have not been charged. Say that to the Americans about Guantanamo, which had British citizens in there too. Now, what does that show? That shows that you can bend over backwards with the British, you can bill and coo, but there are limits to how far that friendship will go. Why? Because of the elections and because of the Tamil diaspora votes.
But you're not suggesting that we should perpetually have people in detention without charge and have civilian lands.
Most certainly not. But we can't have.
Your suggestion is that we should not be doing it to the tune of the United Kingdom.
No, we can't have foreign leaders advising us hypocritically in our own newspapers. Like I said, if he said that to the Americans about Guantanamo, then that's different. And then he should go down to Northern Ireland and talk to some of the families, because he talks about the look on the faces of the families in the north. Now, my point is, we need the Chinese not only because of their money, but because the Chinese and the Russians and the Japanese and all the Latin Americans don't have a Tamil diaspora. That is the truth of it. So they are not susceptible to those electoral pressures. Therefore, they are going to be our firmer, stauncher friends than the West. And that is something the UNP just hasn't got through its head.
But don't you think the strategy of reaching out to the Tamil diaspora also works?
Oh, that's fine, Nadeem. But that is the problem when the Northern Provincial Council, and here Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was quite right when he called Chief Minister Vigneswaran a racist and a liar in that interview. I mean, hats off to Mr. Wickremesinghe. I mean, when you have that kind of ultranationalism building up, you must know that you're going to have problems. Now, Prime Minister David Cameron ends his op-ed, written at the time that President Sirisena is in London. He ends his op-ed on a kind of a threatening note, saying that, look, the report is going to be suspended for 6 months. That's fine, we are with that. But in 6 months, it's going to come and we need to see progress. Look, the Sri Lankan government, what does this mean? I mean, he writes this when President Sirisena is in London and he puts it in a Sri Lankan paper, English language paper. What kind of relationship is that? That's the kind of relationship that made Mahinda Rajapaksa tell David Miliband in the presence of Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, who told me admiringly, he said, Mr. Miliband, we are no longer colony of Britain. You know, so that relationship, when you write that kind of piece with striking those notes in a Sri Lankan paper when the new president of Sri Lanka is visiting your country, that tells me that it's a very complicated relationship. It's going to be a very complicated relationship.
They're taking tips in foreign policy from us and our relationship with China.
Well, you mean from our new administration?
Yeah, well, on our relationship with China.
Well, at least
don't just anger them. Go there and anger them.
At least the British Prime Minister can afford to say the stuff he's saying. Our Prime Minister can't afford to say what we are saying. He said his foreign minister is saying it to the Chinese and he's saying it to the Indians. How smart is that? Simply because you have friends in Washington D.C.
So maybe the president should, because I saw recently Dr. Chris Nonis has been appointed presidential advisor on international affairs. Good. Dr. Jayantha Dhanapala is a senior advisor.
Mr. Dhanapala, yes.
Sorry, Mr. Dhanapala is a senior advisor on international affairs. So maybe the president should be lending out his advisors
to the UNP government, yes, absolutely.
To the foreign minister and the prime minister. How is this strained relationships with China, possibly even strained relationships with India, just months after you've fixed or seem to be on a road towards fixing that relationship, it's said something that will strain it again. A complicated relationship with the West. How will this all pan out in 6 months in Geneva?
Well, Geneva worries me for a very simple reason. Arithmetic. You know, when I was a kid, we didn't have computers. So you had a counting frame, which was basically an abacus. Little colored beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, when you were taught. And I'm now counting the inquiries. When we started off, we had one international inquiry. We knocked it back. We preempted it in May 2009. The Rajapaksa administration in its second term messed up the management and the content of foreign policy. We lost 3 times in Geneva. So we had this one international inquiry. The UN Human Rights Council mandated inquiry by the Office of the High Commissioner, which was unprecedented because the Office of the High Commissioner has not run inquiries into sovereign states before of this sort. Fine. Now, today I'm counting. We now have 3 inquiries.
How so?
How so? Because Now I'm going just by text, not by supposition. Text 1, the UN High Commissioner's letter to the President of the Human Rights Council. Text 2, annexure, Foreign Minister Magdalena Samaraveera's letter to Prince Zaid. Text 3, Foreign Minister Samaraveera's speech at the high-level segment of the Human Rights Council. Just 3 texts. Okay. What we have when you put it together is this. Prince Zaid tells the Human Rights Council, look, 6 months only deferment, but don't worry, we are going to have a stronger resolution. I mean, we are going to have a stronger text, a stronger report at the end. He uses the term stronger, because I am confident that we will have new information. Then, Foreign Minister Samaraveera writes to, and Prince Zaid affixes this to the letter that he sends the President of the Human Rights Council. Foreign Minister Samaraveera says, I look forward to working with you and your office in developing the domestic mechanism for accountability. So, Nadeem, what we have is not a strategy of trading in a domestic mechanism for the international inquiry, which is not the way I would have handled it, but I can understand if somebody does that. Trade-off. No. You have the UN inquiry, which is on hold for 6 months, with every expectation of being stronger because you're going to get new information. Plus, you have a domestic mechanism, which is not strictly domestic because the Foreign Minister says he looks forward to working with the High Commissioner and his office in developing the domestic mechanism. The Foreign Minister goes on to say in an interview with the Daily FT, but also in Geneva, that the domestic mechanism will seek technical assistance from the Office of the High Commissioner, UN bodies, and international human rights watchdogs. Now, the human rights watchdogs have a useful role to play in the world. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, I may have some disagreements, but we need those. But they don't do assistance. That's not their job.
The report on violations.
Exactly.
Violations.
You do not solicit the assistance of international human rights watchdogs to develop your domestic mechanism. So, you're going to have Prince Zaid's report. You're going to have a domestic mechanism with these external components built in, UN as well. And Foreign Minister Samaraveera told the high-level segment in Geneva, it's on the record, he said it live, he said, we look forward to welcoming the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice and Non-Recurrence and the United Nations Working Group on Involuntary and Enforced Disappearances. Now, that's serious. We have, even during the war years, invited and cooperated with special rapporteurs and UN working groups. We've done that. But we've been very careful because we are accountable, first of all, to our citizens. And I'm speaking as an ex-diplomat. Therefore, we've been very careful as to when Sri Lanka admits the working group on involuntary and enforced disappearances. Because the truth is, Nadeem, we were fighting a ferocious, fanatical terrorist movement which deployed more suicide bombers, according to American estimates, than even all of the so-called Islamist movements in the Middle East put together. So there were suicide networks all over the island. So these were ripped out, frankly. They were ripped out. It was a war in the shadows. It was a clandestine war. And every society makes a sovereign decision as to whether and when it will allow an international body to come in and check out about how this war was fought, especially when it comes to uprooting suicide bomber cells. Now, we are welcoming, according to the Foreign Minister, this working group on involuntary and enforced disappearances. They're going to come in, they're going to check out what happened in Jaffna when, as a result of the Pongu Tamil, there was a civilian militia called Makkalpade, which was built up in order to assault the army camps. And when General Fonseca took over, one of the first things he did was to have to preempt them. And I remember my friend Taraki, DP Sivaram, who was assassinated, and when he was buried under Tiger flag because it was almost certain that he was an LTT, at the very least an asset. And he used to write in his column that the Sri Lankan armed forces will never really be able to prosecute a northeastern campaign because of the deterrent capacity the Tigers have. And that deterrent capacity is to launch devastating strikes right into the Sinhala heartland, as he put it, and paralyze the capital city. Now that didn't happen. It didn't happen because the Sri Lankan armed forces, including its intelligence arms, uprooted that infrastructure. Now how that was done, and whether we should expose it to the full light of day, that's a sovereign decision. That's not a decision for Mangala Samaraveera, who's the foreign minister of an unelected government, to take. But it's taken that decision. And that team is going to come in.
Whose decision is it?
That's Mangala's decision.
No, I mean, whose decision is it? If this is
the president,
classified information.
The president of Sri Lanka and the National Security Council. Now, the team comes in. Mangala has already promised to welcome them. They come in, they do their report. In the meanwhile, Mr. Sumandaran goes on the record telling Tamil audiences, don't worry about the 6-month suspension. It gives us a chance to go from village to village and get more information and give it to them, and it's going to be stronger in 6 months. So, it's very credible, very likely that not only is the working group on enforced disappearances going to get information about actual disappearances, very probably of Tiger suicide cadre, but it will also be exposed to sob stories organized by the TNA as it has already promised its supporters.
Hypothetically, let's say that a stronger report is presented by the OISL. Let's say that a domestic mechanism with these external components, including human rights watchdogs, does investigate and go on to prosecute even.
And there's a third, sorry to interrupt, because Mangala Samaraveera, Foreign Minister, has also said, and he set up in the Foreign Ministry a Truth and Reconciliation and Transitional Justice Task Force, and he says that we'll be adopting South African type TRC. That's the third investigation or the third mechanism, while the South Africans have said, look, you can't imitate ours. So instead of one external inquiry,
okay, let's
you're going to have three for the price of one.
Let's say hypothetically that these three inquiries go ahead and come to some sort of an end. Where does that leave the country?
In the first place, we would have been the first to put our necks on that chopper. I mean, it's something that even the Indians pointed out in 2014 when they supported Sri Lanka and opposed the international inquiry, OP10, Operative Clause 10. The Indian delegation pointed out in Geneva that never before has the Office of the High Commissioner been asked to do this kind of investigation. So, we would be the first in line. We would have submitted ourselves to something that no other sovereign state has done under similar circumstances, and we would have added on to that two supposedly domestic mechanisms.
But what would be the consequences of these three mechanisms coming to an end? What can we expect after that?
Well, we will have as the same thing that High Commissioner Zaid Al Hussein expects, a stronger report. A stronger report against Sri Lanka, which, as Chief Minister Vigneswaran says, can be used for legal purposes.
I think you misunderstood the question. What I mean is, after the stronger report comes out, after the domestic mechanism has been concluded, let's say there are prosecutions and so on and so forth. I mean, after this is over, after that chapter is sort of done, where does that leave Sri Lanka?
That will leave Sri Lanka in a place that is so unfortunate and vulnerable that is the reason that countries from Spain to Indonesia to the Philippines to Brazil never did it. That is the reason that many countries have not done this. And the British didn't do it as part of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, if, as the British say, accountability and truth-seeking is an inevitable part of reconciliation, why didn't they have one after the Good Friday Agreement? They've not done it. There is a reason that states don't do that. It's lacerating. It's polarizing.
Causes more fissures than
absolutely.
fixes.
So that is why I think that there was another option. There were two other options that this government didn't take, the new administration. One, since we have repaired our relations with Delhi, we could have rebuilt the coalition that we had in 2009, India, China, and the rest, and tell the High Commissioner, look, please, take this back. And the other would have been a straightforward swap. We're going to do a domestic inquiry along the lines of the LLRC, not outside it. We'd like this to go away, and if it doesn't go away, we have the numbers in terms of votes of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, the government has not taken those two options, and instead we have, as I said on the abacus, the counting frame, we have more inquiries than we had earlier, and the one that we had earlier is not going away. It's going to be strengthened by welcoming this UN group, the working group on disappearances.
Dr. Jayatillaka, thank you very much. As always, it's been enlightening, enriching, and interesting to see.
And I hope provocative.
Thought-provoking, definitely thought-provoking. Well, we'd also like to know what you think. Is absolute accountability and seeking the truth absolutely a prerequisite for reconciliation? Let us know what you think. Go to Newsfirst.lk. You can also, where you can watch previous episodes of Vantage Point and this episode as well, shortly after it is aired on TV. Post your comments on the comment section. Alternatively, visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/newsfirst.english, and let us know what you think. Is it a prerequisite? Where does Sri Lanka need to move? Which way does the country need to move? We are interested in hearing your thoughts. Until next time, I'm Lanka.